Welcome to Archive Vault, where we explore declassified records, hidden histories, and state-level investigations. Please note, some illustrative narration is AI-generated for storytelling purposes. All content is educational and documentary-based. Weapons are usually made of steel. They are forged, sharpened, designed to pierce. But there is another category of weapon, one that carries no edge, one that does not strike outward, but inward. In medieval Europe, a collection of objects was given a name: Arma Christi, the weapons of Christ. The list is familiar: a cross, nails, a crown of thorns, a spear, a whip, a sponge on a reed. These were not tools of victory, they were tools of suffering, and yet they were called weapons. That naming matters, because a weapon does not need to kill to exert power. The Arma Christi were displayed in churches, carried in processions, illustrated in manuscripts. They were meant to be seen, not as relics of brutality, but as instruments of triumph. Triumph over what? Not an army, not territory. Sin, doubt, fear. The paradox is deliberate. Objects used to torture are reframed as symbols of salvation. Pain becomes strategy, submission becomes strength, and once suffering is sanctified, it can be mobilized. During periods of religious warfare, these symbols did not remain confined to prayer. They appeared on banners, on shields, on the armor of men preparing for battle. A crown of thorns above a sword, a cross above a spear. The message was subtle, but clear. This violence is justified. This war is righteous. These wounds are holy. The Arma Christi did something profound. They fused suffering with authority. If Christ endured pain willingly, then endurance became virtue. If sacrifice secured redemption, then sacrifice could be demanded. And once sacrifice is demanded, war becomes easier to explain. Not as conquest, but as duty. This is not a story about religion alone. It is about symbols, about how objects acquire meaning far beyond their material form. A nail becomes proof of love. A spear becomes validation of prophecy. A scourge becomes testimony. And when symbols are weaponized, they travel faster than armies. They move through belief. They organize emotion. They justify action. The Arma Christi were never fired from cannons, but they marched, quietly, visibly, embedded in faith. This episode is not about theology. It is about how suffering, once elevated, can become a rallying cry, and how the line between devotion and warfare can blur without anyone noticing the shift. Because the most powerful weapons are the ones people carry willingly. There is a shift that happens quietly. At first, the Arma Christi are reminders of endurance, symbols of sacrifice, objects that ask the believer to reflect inward. But reflection can be redirected. When suffering is elevated high enough, it stops being something to survive and starts becoming something to imitate. That is the pivot. If pain is holy, then enduring pain becomes proof of faith. If death leads to salvation, then dying for the cause becomes a form of victory. This is where martyrdom stops being memory and becomes strategy. During periods of religious conflict, sermons did not merely recount suffering. They emphasized reward, eternal life, glory, honor. Not for those who avoid harm, but for those who accept it. The Arma Christi reinforced this logic visually. The nails were not displayed as warnings. They were displayed as triumphs. The spear was not shown as brutality. It was shown as fulfillment. When violence is reframed as part of a divine narrative, fear loses leverage. And when fear loses leverage, leaders gain influence. Because the greatest obstacle to warfare is self-preservation. Remove the fear of death, or reinterpret it, and obedience strengthens. This does not require fanaticism, it requires meaning. If suffering is random, it terrifies. If suffering is purposeful, it mobilizes. That distinction transforms crowds. Armies carrying banners marked with sacred symbols were not simply fighting territory. They were participating in cosmic alignment. To retreat would not merely mean defeat, it would mean spiritual failure. That pressure is difficult to resist, especially when reinforced by community. Martyr stories circulated widely, accounts of individuals who faced execution calmly, who refused to renounce belief, who met death with composure. These stories did not discourage violence, they normalized it, not as aggression, but as testimony. The darker truth is this: when martyrdom becomes aspirational, leaders do not need to coerce. Believers volunteer, and when enough people volunteer, war sustains itself. The Arma Christi functioned as more than devotional art. They were psychological anchors. They reminded followers that suffering was not evidence of defeat. It was evidence of participation in something larger than survival. That belief is powerful. It can inspire courage. It can inspire resilience. It can also justify escalation, because if your wounds are sacred, then your enemy's wounds become necessary. And once necessary harm is accepted, limits erode. Not instantly, gradually through sermons, through symbols, through repetition. This is the point where warfare stops being strategic and becomes existential. No longer about winning, about proving. And when proving replaces winning, conflict deepens. The Arma Christi did not command armies directly. They shaped imagination. And imagination is where wars are decided long before they begin. The most dangerous weapon is not steel. It is a story that makes suffering meaningful. Because once suffering has meaning, it can be endured indefinitely. And once it can be endured indefinitely, it can be demanded. The Arma Christi were never swords. They were reminders of suffering: a cross, nails, a spear, a crown of thorns, objects that marked humiliation. But when those symbols began appearing on banners carried into war, something shifted. In 1099, when Crusaders entered Jerusalem, chroniclers wrote that blood reached the ankles of horses. That detail may be exaggerated. The violence was not. The cross marked both devotion and destruction. No contradiction was acknowledged. During the Spanish Inquisition, crosses hung in courtrooms. Confessions were extracted beneath them. Punishments were framed as purification. Suffering was no longer endured. It was administered. During the 30 Years' War, entire regions of Central Europe were devastated. Cities emptied, harvests burned, populations reduced by famine and disease. Each side invoked divine legitimacy. The same symbol blessed both armies. That is the unsettling symmetry. When suffering is sacred, it does not prevent war. It can rationalize it. Fast forward. World War I. Christian nations fighting each other. Soldiers carried crosses into trenches. Artillery roared after prayer. Each side believed God understood their position. The symbol did not dissolve under contradiction. It adapted. And now modern conflicts. Across religions and ideologies, sacred language still frames violence. Not always openly, sometimes subtly. The fallen are elevated, the cause purified by blood. The dead become banners. The narrative hardens. The mechanism remains unchanged. Sacrifice becomes validation. And once sacrifice validates a cause, questioning it becomes moral failure. That is where devotion turns strategic. That is where restraint weakens. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The Arma Christi were meant to represent suffering absorbed, not inflicted. But symbols are not fixed. They are interpreted. And once interpreted collectively, they acquire force. A cross can remind someone to forgive, or it can convince someone they are divinely aligned. That difference is not theological, it is contextual. And context is shaped by leaders, war, fear, and identity. This is the disturbing conclusion. When suffering becomes sacred, it gains power. When it gains power, it can be mobilized. When it is mobilized, it rarely remains symbolic. The instruments of one man's execution became the visual language of movements, armies, and states. Not because the objects changed, but because meaning did. And meaning, once weaponized, is harder to disarm than steel. Because steel rusts, stories don't. Thank you for listening to Archive Vault Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive and found it insightful. Wishing you a great week ahead, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss our next episode. We'll be back soon with more stories from the archives. See you next time.